Happy Friday. I hope you guys are having a beautiful Friday so far. I'd like to welcome you back to our Nurau Talks, where we interview experts in mental health at the workplace and talk about what is going on in the field, what their research is about, and how we can apply it to the workplace. And so today I am very honored to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Gilbert, who works on grief and pregnancy loss at the workplace. So, hi, Stephanie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I'm just going to read a little bio here to introduce you. So Dr. Stephanie Gilbert, she's an associate professor in the Shannon School of Business at Cape Breton University, which she just told me is between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, a very beautiful little place. She received her doctorate in industrial and organizational psychology from St. Mary's University. Her research examines predictors of leadership effectiveness and emergence, including leaders' own motivation for leadership, and also examines how grieving employees experience work. And more specifically, we'll talk about this a bit more soon about pregnancy loss and miscarriage. So Dr. Gilbert has worked with a variety of industries, including healthcare, nonprofit, for-profit, and startups, and she teaches in the areas of leadership and organizational behavior. So, Dr. Gilbert, your research looks into workplaces, how workplaces can better support employees working through grief. So I just was wondering if you could talk a bit about what the status quo is right now. So what sorts of supports workplaces are giving to employees who have had a tragic event happen to them, whether it's a death or miscarriage, whatever it is. How is grief being addressed at the workplace right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's kind of broadly, the most common support would be whatever is offered by your bereavement leave policy if your organization has one. So smaller organizations might not have one at all. Larger organizations might. And those policies typically provide a certain amount of time off to employees based on the nature of the relationship to the person that they've lost. So I think it's most common to get about 3 days off for a close relationship, so a parent or a spouse or a child, and then less time for what would be normally considered to be like more distal relationships. So half a day for a nephew or an uncle or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, then that would be kind of your time off. Beyond that, the other most typical support might be through an employee assistance plan. Again, if your organization has one. So if you have access to that and you've been reminded about that resource, employees may or may not make use of that. And we typically find that those EAP or EFAP programs are underutilized, and employees often feel that they don't really meet their needs. A lot of organizations wouldn't necessarily have like a bereavement counselor as part of their program, for example. You might be more likely to just get more general counseling. So those would be kind of the two formal supports offered to employees more typically. And then beyond that, whatever other support you'd get would be informal. So whatever your boss decides to offer you, or if your boss happens to be very compassionate, they might say to you, take all the time that you need, and then actually enable you to be able to do that. But that informal support is going to vary a lot based on the nature of your workplace, who your boss is, and how supportive your coworkers are.
Mm-hmm. So it's very, it really depends, I guess, on your managers and how much they feel equipped to handle a grieving employee. And what are you finding? I know we talked earlier about trainings. Do you find there are trainings available for managers? How equipped generally are managers in dealing with grief? Do you find that there is a baseline knowledge, or is it really lacking?
I think it's really lacking. And I think it's reflective of the general grief illiteracy in our society, that we really kind of don't talk about death and loss. And so we don't really know how to address it when it does come up. So what I'm tending to find when I talk to employees is that employees whose boss has had a personal experience themselves with loss, those bosses tend to be more supportive. Like they tend to get it and be a little more understanding. But if a boss hasn't had that experience, then they don't really understand what they could offer in terms of informal supports. So like that variation is going to lead to sometimes perceptions of unfairness, across your organization. So one employee with a very compassionate boss might get 2 weeks off. Another employee might get just their 3 days of bereavement leave. And that can lead to problems, right? That lack of consistency. But again, we want to balance that consistency with meeting the individual person's needs, which is really the most important thing.
Right. Yeah, I think one issue with grief perhaps is that in today's work culture, it's all about productivity. So I think there's this pressure almost to, especially if the employer hasn't been through something similar, it's kind of like, okay, well, I'll give you a certain amount of time, but then now it's time for you to get back to work, and kind of putting a timeline on that grief. Do you see that kind of mentality of employers feeling pressurized to get their employees back to work and kind of get over that grief quickly?
Yeah, totally. Especially right now where I think workplaces tend to be more under-resourced than over-resourced, right? And we need our employees back to work, and we kind of need all hands on deck in a lot of cases. And those 3 days of bereavement leave that are in your bereavement policy are kind of prescribing what to do after your loss. You have your loss, you get the funeral done with, and then you should be ready to go back to work. And that's that kind of is a script to follow. And the important thing to know about grief is that when we're grieving, it's very typical to have kind of a brain fog come over you, and it can be very difficult to make decisions in that time, and especially to advocate for yourself. So people who are grieving are not likely to go to their boss and say, hey, I need more than the 3 days off, right? Or I need a private place to go on my breaks at work, or I need a gradual return to work plan after my loss, right? So what's more typical is for employees to do the easiest thing in that time, which is to take their 3 days and go back to work and not really cause any problems, right? And they don't have to do a whole lot of thinking about how can they be accommodated or what could they request. So a lot of employees tell me that they do go back to work, maybe even earlier than they might have to, and that they wanted to get back to normal. But a lot of those same employees would later say to me, looking back, I wish I had taken more time. I think I really needed more time off. So it's hard to say if going back to work after the 3 days is that people are doing that because that's when they're truly ready, or are they doing that because that's the norm and that's what's expected of us after a loss?
Yeah, and I think it's hard too, as someone who is grieving, to know what you need in that moment. So learning, I liked what you said about not knowing how to advocate for yourself. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues, is you're not advocating for yourself because you're incapacitated. Like, you just emotionally don't know how to heal and what you need, and then your managers not doing it either. And so I think probably on both sides, that's what's leading to this pressure to have to kind of get yourself together and get back to work.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to know what it is that you actually need in that time. And, it's very common for managers, even very supportive ones or colleagues, to say, let me know if you need anything. But then it's really hard sometimes to know, well, what is it that I need, or what can I ask for, or what are the possibilities? So if there's like a written policy, for example, that can outline those various possibilities, and that can say, these are the types of accommodations we could offer when you come back to work, then at least those options are there. And it's a little bit more clear to the employee what they could ask for.
Yeah, that's good. I want to talk a bit more specifically about pregnancy loss. So do you find, you mentioned that people aren't likely to share as much. Do you find that women are more likely to be silent about having a miscarriage versus another tragic event? And why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think that they are much more likely to be silent, and it's for a lot of different reasons. One is that pregnancy loss, so it's either miscarriage or stillbirth or termination for medical reasons. It could be ectopic pregnancy. So there's a lot of ways that people can experience pregnancy loss, and it tends to be more stigmatized. It's something we just don't talk about. And sometimes there's still like feelings of shame with the person experiencing that, or guilt, or feelings of failure. So I think for those reasons, we tend not to talk much about it, or women or gestational parents, I should say, might not want to disclose that they're going through that. But there are other reasons not to disclose pregnancy loss too. One of them is often simply that we tend to have, like, again, society prescribes kind of a normal time to announce your pregnancy. And so if you haven't already announced it, then, and you have a miscarriage, you might not want to then disclose that you've had a loss. It might be kind of weird or uncomfortable to say, okay, I was pregnant, but I had a loss. And then if you do disclose at that point, will people really understand what you're going through? Will they kind of, how will they respond to that? Will they be empathetic because they didn't know you were pregnant anyway?
Right. Easy
So
to
that's
hide.
right. Yeah. So there's another reason. But what I hear from a lot of women about why they don't share about their pregnancy loss is that they don't, often the people going through that are in earlier stages of their career. They might be in a vulnerable place. Maybe they're on a probationary term or a contract, or they're wanting to advance in the future at work. And so having a pregnancy loss and telling your employer that kind of signals that you are trying to have a family, and that it, in the next year or so, you might get pregnant again and then want to go on maternity leave. And so women have, like, I think, a valid fear that disclosing that to their boss could signal that they might be off on maternity leave in the near future, and that could jeopardize some of their opportunities at work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And you talk about as well in your articles, which we'll post in the chat now, but that there's very little research actually being done on pregnancy loss and workplace support. And I was curious to know what sorts of research questions you would like to see being looked into, and how you see the field expanding. What kind of things need to come out, you think?
Yeah, there's so much to do. So I'm just, first of all, trying to understand what are the effects of getting support or not getting support at work through this experience. So the effects for the employee's well-being, maybe their grief outcomes, but also their work outcomes. So I want to look at that. I also want to look at, like, what characterizes good support and bad support. And so I guess the ultimate goal would be, can we make some really good recommendations to organizations about what a good policy around pregnancy loss might look like? What might management training look like? What can coworkers do when somebody's experienced pregnancy loss? And so to kind of be able to provide those recommendations after doing, like, an intervention study or something would be really neat. So we're kind of working towards that as an ultimate goal.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to see, if keeping in touch with you, Stephanie, about what the possible intervention could be. That I think that'd be really interesting. And I know you have to do a lot of back end work to kind of figure out what is the problem, what is the status quo. But maybe just, if you could dream right now, based on what you know of workplaces and what they need, what would you say your hope is for workplaces in how they could support women, better support women? And we have managers, employees who listen to this live. What would you say to them about what you hope for them?
Well, okay, so there's lots of things. I would hope, though, that workplaces could kind of take a closer look at their policies. So even bereavement leave policies, and look at, does this include pregnancy loss? Because in most cases, pregnancy loss isn't eligible for bereavement leave. But also to look at what kinds of accommodations can we provide to people who are going through this, and to be creative if necessary. Can people work from home? Can they return to work gradually? Can they work in a private place? There's a lot of different options for work accommodations. And then that ongoing emotional support is really important. So acknowledging, and it's not just women, it's men as well, who experience pregnancy loss and might have a lot of trouble afterwards with the psychological recovery. But women have a physical recovery too after a loss, and might need accommodation for that. So I think generally too, we need to have more conversations about pregnancy loss to legitimize that as a real loss, that you're losing a hope for a future, and you're losing a baby that you hoped to have. And that can be really significant for people.
Yeah. No, I love that idea of having more conversation and raising awareness really of the fact that miscarriage and pregnancy loss really is a loss, and it's not just a thing that people have to get over.
Right.
So allowing spaces for that, I think, is really key. And I love to see that in workplaces as well. I think it goes with the whole women and men, and I like that you said, but men as well experience psychological effects of losing a child as well.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And it's important to know that if employees qualify for employment insurance, they can access more leave options than you might be aware of. So there's maternity leave options for a stillbirth, a later pregnancy loss, and sickness leave options that can provide up to 15 weeks of leave. So I think that's really important, something important that people aren't usually aware of.
Mm.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for all the work you do. I think out of all the researchers I've come across, haven't come across anyone looking at pregnancy loss and workplaces yet. So it's really important, I think, to be covering this gap. And I'm so glad that you are,
Thank you.
and looking forward to seeing what sorts of policies and what sorts of changes will be made in the workplaces.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Vivienne.
Yeah, of course. And thank you everyone for joining us today at our Nurau Talk. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another talk for you. So have a great Friday, everyone, and a good weekend.